In 1688, when William of Orange landed on the English coast at Torbay with 400 warships, his quartermasters carried a vegetable that had been altered in the wet clay of West Friesland to turn an entire kingdom's soil into a political flag. Right now, under the cold hum of fluorescent lights in your local supermarket, that exact same organism rests inside a perforated plastic bag. It sits washed, uniform, and unnaturally bright in the crisp drawer of your refrigerator, stripped of every trace of the violence that birthed it. We treat it as an inert piece of produce, a mindless background element of daily survival. But you are not looking at a natural gift of the earth. You are looking at a living geopolitical monument, forged in the fires of an 80-year war of independence and selectively bred to erase 8 centuries of global botanical history. The orange root you buy today did not evolve in peace. It was constructed under siege. It was not a random mutation. It was statecraft. Which brings me to wonder what other ordinary item resting on your counter carries a bloodline born of war. Tell me in the comments which food history we should investigate next, because when you strip away the modern packaging, the story sitting on your kitchen table reaches deep into forgotten military campaigns and state-sponsored botanical erasure. To understand how this root became a weapon of political warfare, we have to look past the modern grocery aisle and retreat 1,000 years into the high, arid valleys of the Hindu Kush. In the 10th century, the ancestor of this plant looked nothing like the smooth, sweet cylinder sitting in your cold drawer. It was a gnarled, tough, intensely bitter taproot, bleeding a dark violet juice that stained the calloused hands of anyone who pulled it from the mountain dirt. Its color came from dense concentrations of anthocyanins, the same protective dark pigments found in wild blackberries and nightshades. It was thin, fibrous, and brutally tough, surviving in rocky, wind-scoured earth where delicate crops withered. Carried along transcontinental trade corridors by merchant caravans and Islamic scholars, these dark purple roots traveled westward across thousands of miles of dust and salt. By the 12th century, they had crossed the Mediterranean into Islamic Iberia, where Moorish agronomists cultivated them in the meticulously irrigated soil of Al-Andalus. In the experimental gardens of Córdoba and Granada, botanical treatises recorded 2 distinct variants growing side by side in the damp earth: the ancient purple taproot from the east, and a pale yellowish mutant that occasionally sprouted in sandy riverbeds. Manuscripts preserved in archival vaults show that for centuries, purple and yellow were the only recognized colors of this crop across Europe and the Middle East. Orange did not exist in the fields. In fact, the word orange was not even used as a color descriptor in Western Europe. It was merely the name of a rare, costly fruit imported from northern India. The root that dominates modern global agriculture was nowhere to be found in the ancient world. For generations, these purple taproots were harvested as a low-status, durable crop, tough enough to keep peasant populations alive through frozen winters and barren harvest cycles. But as European trade routes expanded northward during the late Middle Ages, these ancient seeds were carried out of the sun-drenched Mediterranean basin and planted into the cold, waterlogged clay of the Low Countries. There, under the oppressive shadow of the Spanish Habsburg Empire, the nature of this crop was about to change forever. The bloody military occupation of the Dutch provinces would soon transform a dark mountain root into an agricultural secret, bred deliberately to defy an imperial army. In 1568, that shadow turned into an open slaughter. King Philip II of Spain, ruling the world's most formidable empire from his cold granite palace in Madrid, determined that the Protestant rebellions in the Low Countries would be crushed beneath the full weight of imperial violence. He dispatched the Duke of Alba and 10,000 heavily armored Spanish veterans across the Alps into the Dutch provinces. This was not merely a military pacification. It was an economic execution designed to break the spirit of a rebellious nation. Spanish garrison commanders imposed the 10th penny, a ruinous 10% tax levied on every commercial transaction and every harvest yield pulled from the mud. Spanish soldiers marched from farmstead to farmstead, confiscating grain reserves, slaughtering draft horses, and hanging farmers who dared to bury seeds beneath their floorboards. For the Dutch peasantry, life was compressed into a grim arithmetic of survival. You either fed the Spanish crown or you starved in your own furrows. The horror reached its absolute zenith in the autumn of 1574 during the Siege of Leiden. For 5 months, imperial forces locked 60,000 citizens inside the city walls, establishing a ring of earthworks and redoubts that choked off every road, canal, and supply line. Famine became the primary siege engine of the Habsburg army. Archival records from inside the besieged city describe a community reduced to bone and ash. As horses, cats, and street dogs disappeared from the alleys, starving civilians crowded along the inside of the ramparts, scraping through the frozen mud with fingernails and bone knives to pry up wild, bitter taproots from the canal banks. They boiled raw leaves, chewed on tanned leather harness straps, and consumed bitter purple roots so tough and stringy they tore the gums. The roots were sharp, astringent, and thick with tannin. They tasted of rot and river silt. But they kept hearts beating while thousands perished from dysentery and starvation around them. When Dutch rebels finally broke the siege by cutting the dikes and sailing flat-bottomed warships across flooded farmland straight to the city walls, they found a population hollowed by hunger. The horror of Leiden proved to the rebel leadership that independence could never be secured on the battlefield alone. War required calories. An army, and the civilian population behind it, needed a crop that could withstand the damp, harsh winters of the north and yield massive tonnage from tiny plots of waterlogged land. 60 miles north of the ruined fields of Leiden, in the damp, wind-scoured clay of West Friesland, the agricultural guilds of Hoorn and Enkhuizen began quietly engineering an answer. These were not university scholars or royal botanists. They were mud-stained seed selectors, men who spent their lives kneeling in silty, brackish soil along the edge of the Zuider Zee. In these marshy coastal fields, a subtle botanical glitch began to appear. Among the endless rows of bitter purple and pale yellow roots imported centuries earlier, rare genetic mutations sprouted, roots that turned a bright, unnatural orange in the heavy, damp soil. Under normal conditions, a farmer would have discarded these orange roots as weak, useless genetic outliers. But the seed selectors of Hoorn and Enkhuizen looked closer. They observed that these orange mutations carried distinct advantages in the harsh northern climate. They were thicker, grew faster in cold clay, stored exceptionally well through frozen winters, and contained a rich concentration of natural sugars that masked the ancient bitterness of the wild plant. Crucially, the plant produced massive quantities of beta-carotene, giving its skin and flesh a vivid, instantly recognizable pigment that no wild root possessed. It was not an accident of nature. It was an isolated genetic trait waiting to be forged. Working through long, freezing winters, guild members began systematically isolating these orange specimens. They planted them in protected enclosures, hand-selecting only the most brilliantly colored taproots for seed production, while ruthlessly culling any plant that reverted to purple or pale yellow. Year after year, they forced the genome of a wild Asian weed to bend to the agricultural needs of a nation at war. It did not take long for the political architect of the Dutch revolt to recognize what was happening in the fields of West Friesland. William I, Prince of Orange, the leader orchestrating the armed rebellion against the Spanish crown, saw in this newly engineered root something far more valuable than mere calories. He saw a living symbol. The House of Orange-Nassau made the calculated decision to quietly finance and protect the guild masterminds behind this selective breeding program, laying the groundwork to turn an engineered vegetable into a weapon of statecraft. William the Silent understood a reality that modern military historians often overlook. Flags can be torn down from city gates. Written manifestos can be burned by occupying armies. But a crop growing in the mud is a physical occupation of the soil. The heraldic banner of the House of Orange-Nassau was a vivid, unmistakable orange. As the Dutch provinces settled into a grueling war of attrition against Spanish dominance, the prince saw an opportunity to convert agricultural land into a living partisan flag. Every crop grown in the Low Countries was visible to passing imperial patrols. A harvest of traditional purple or pale yellow roots signaled obedience, or at best, passive submission to Spanish rule. But an entire field glowing with a bright, genetically isolated orange root was an act of open defiance. It was not agriculture, it was an occupation of the dirt. The seed guilds in West Friesland were instructed to double their efforts. They were no longer breeding merely for yield or winter stability. They were breeding for pigment saturation. They exploited the unique soil chemistry of the coastal Netherlands, where brackish groundwater and high salt deposits forced the plants into survival stress, driving massive concentrations of beta-carotene into the core of the taproot. If you value these unvarnished record extractions from history's shadow, consider subscribing to ensure these files remain open. What began in small guild enclosures quickly expanded into an enforced test of political loyalty across the rebel provinces. Local magistrates quietly pressured farming communities to destroy their traditional purple seed stocks. To plant the ancient purple root was to cling to the feudal past overseen by Spanish tax collectors and Catholic bishops. To plant orange was to invest in the Republic. Consider the reality for a farm hand standing in the freezing clay of a Dutch winter. Your survival depended on what sat in your cellar. If Spanish imperial soldiers raided your homestead and found dark purple taproots in your storage bins, you were merely a local producer paying taxes to Madrid. But if they opened your cellar doors to reveal thousands of fluorescent orange cylinders, you were branded a partisan loyal to the House of Orange. The botanical displacement was swift and unforgiving. Within 2 generations, the ancient purple taproots that had sustained populations from the valleys of Central Asia to the Mediterranean basin for 800 years were systematically cleared from Dutch soil. They were not wiped out by natural blight or environmental shift. They were engineered out of existence because their color failed to match a dynastic brand. By the turn of the 17th century, this altered root was no longer just a local crop. It was a standardized logistical asset. Its high sugar and starch content allowed it to be stored in damp cellars for up to 8 months without rotting, supplying essential calories to the Dutch garrison towns holding the defensive lines along the Rhine. The Spanish crown attempted to ban the cultivation of the orange variant in the territories under its control, but an imperial decree cannot police millions of microscopic seeds buried beneath 6 inches of wet clay. The soil itself had taken a side in the war. By 1609, when a temporary truce halted the fighting, the Dutch Republic had secured its borders, and its landscape had been completely repainted in orange. But the House of Orange and the merchant oligarchs of Amsterdam had no intention of keeping this biological asset confined to the Low Countries. In the shipyards of Rotterdam and Enkhuizen, the massive merchant fleets of the Dutch East and West India Companies were being outfitted for long-distance oceanic deployment, deep inside their hold manifests. Alongside barrels of salt pork and iron shot, quartermasters packed hundreds of sealed wooden kegs filled with orange carrot seeds. The engineered route was about to leave the cold clay of West Friesland behind, carried aboard armed merchantmen to displace native crops across every major trade route on Earth. As those heavy wooden hulls cleared the harbors of Texel and Flushing, they carried a biological engine that would reshape global agriculture. The directors of the Dutch East India Company, operating from the dark mahogany boardrooms of Amsterdam, did not view crops through the lens of culinary preference. They viewed them as cold equations of mass, durability, and operational range. On a long-distance ocean voyage, human bodies deteriorated with terrifying speed. Scurvy rotted the gums of sailors, while damp rot devoured shipboard provisions within weeks of leaving port. The engineered orange root was the ultimate answer to imperial logistics. Packed tightly into dry sand inside oak barrels, these dense taproots could remain fresh for over 6 months in the dark, humid bellies of wooden vessels. They provided critical nutrition and high-calorie density while occupying minimal storage volume per deck ton. Every merchant fleet setting sail for the Cape of Good Hope, Java, or the Americas carried thousands of small leather pouches filled with orange seed. Wherever the company established a victualling station, a fort, or a trading post, the surrounding soil was immediately tilled and sown with the Dutch corporate crop. At the Cape of Good Hope, established in 1652 as a naval resupply depot midway between Europe and Asia, company agronomists cleared native scrubland to plant massive, structured gardens of orange roots. Ships pulling into Table Bay were not restocked with local African tubers or indigenous greens. They were fed on the exact same orange taproots cultivated in the mud of West Friesland. In Asian ports from the markets of Batavia to the Dutch enclave at Deshima in Japan, traditional purple taproots were steadily squeezed out of maritime commerce. Dutch trade monopolies dictated what was bought, sold, and planted along global sea lanes. If a local harbor wanted to trade with European merchants, its surrounding farming hinterlands had to cultivate crops that met naval specifications. The dark, ancient Asian roots with their bitter skins and bleeding purple juice, were systematically discarded by merchant fleets that demanded uniform, sweet, durable orange cylinders. By the mid-17th century, the botanical legacy of the Silk Road was being systematically dismantled by imperial trade routes. The purple root was forced into isolation, surviving only in remote pockets of Central Asia and regional mountain villages, erased from the global ledger of maritime commerce. By the late 17th century, this engineered route was ready to execute its ultimate political takeover. When William of Orange launched his naval expedition to claim the English throne in the autumn of 1688, the fleet stretching across the horizon carried far more than infantry regiments and cavalry mounts. Tucked into the cargo holds of the transport vessels was the complete infrastructure of a Dutch state, including thousands of weight tons of agricultural stores and seed reserves. Quartermaster manifests from the landing operations reveal an obsessive attention to agrarian supply lines. The Dutch command knew that securing the English crown required holding the English countryside without starving the local population or exhausting the land. Supply ships dumped iron-bound barrels of Dutch orange seed directly onto the beaches, where they were distributed to supply bases along the march toward London. It was a botanical invasion operating behind the cover of a political coup. English landowners, eager to curry favor with the new monarch, cleared their gardens of native turnip and parsnip varieties to plant the bright orange root of the House of Nassau. To serve the crop at a feast or cultivate it on an estate was a visual declaration of allegiance to the new regime. Within 2 decades, English soil was producing the exact same dynastic vegetable that had been foraged in the marshes of West Friesland. By the end of the 18th century, the transformation was complete across the Western world. The original purple root was no longer just displaced, it was forgotten. Botanical treatises began referring to orange as the natural baseline color of the species, treating purple and yellow variants as strange, degenerate anomalies rather than the original ancient stock. An entire civilization had been trained to view a 100-year-old political propaganda project as a simple gift of nature. The root sat on every dinner table from London to Philadelphia, its orange flesh taken for granted, its violent origins buried deep beneath generations of topsoil. Yet the geopolitical career of this engineered plant was far from over. It would remain sitting quietly in the cold cellars of Europe, waiting for another global conflict, where an imperial government would once again turn its bright orange flesh into a cover story for military intelligence. In the dark autumn of 1940, as German bombers rained incendiaries over London during the Blitz, the British Ministry of Information pulled a centuries-old agricultural artifact out of its archives and weaponized it for a second time. The Royal Air Force had just achieved a staggering breakthrough in military technology. They had successfully miniaturized radar equipment, mounting airborne interception radar sets directly into the noses of night fighter aircraft. For the first time in naval and aerial warfare, British pilots could track and destroy enemy bombers through dense cloud cover and total darkness before the Luftwaffe crews even knew they were being hunted. It was a secret that could alter the entire trajectory of the war. If the German High Command realized radar was being carried aboard individual fighters, they would scramble to alter their tactics and counter the frequency. British military intelligence needed a cover story. Fast, they found their answer sitting in the soil of the English countryside. The ministry launched a massive press campaign centered on a single ace pilot, Flight Lieutenant John Cunningham, nicknamed Cat's Eyes by the national press. Newspapers, posters, and radio broadcasts reported that Cunningham possessed uncanny, almost supernatural night vision. The secret to his incredible tally of nocturnal victories was not advanced electronic sensors hidden in his cockpit. The ministry claimed it was a steady daily diet of orange carrots, rich in carotene, which allowed his retinas to pierce the black skies over the English Channel. It was a lie of brilliant, layered efficiency. German intelligence swallowed the story, analyzing crop reports and ration quotas to determine if dietary changes could confer tactical advantages in night combat. But the deception served a second, equally critical purpose on the home front. With German U-boats sinking Atlantic merchant convoys and choking off food imports, the British population faced severe calorie deficits. The government needed its citizens to consume massive quantities of cheap, homegrown root vegetables. Under the campaign banners of Dig for Victory, millions of British citizens tore up their flower gardens and planted fields of the vibrant orange crop, convinced that eating it would help them navigate dark blackout streets without streetlights. It was a total fabrication. While severe vitamin A deficiency can cause night blindness, consuming excess carotene will never grant a human eye the ability to see in the dark. It was cold military deception, designed to hide steel and wire radar technology behind a curtain of cheap vegetation. Consider the weight of what sits inside your kitchen right now. That uniform orange cylinder resting in your crisp drawer is not a natural product of evolution. It is a twice-engineered relic of state control. It carries two distinct layers of imperial propaganda fused into the same genetic tissue. The first layer was forged in the wet clay of West Friesland in the late 16th century, when Dutch seed guilds selectively bred a wild mutant to turn agricultural land into a living flag for the House of Orange during an 80-year war of independence. The second layer was stamped onto it in 1940 by British intelligence officers looking for a narrative shield to protect radar secrets from Nazi military intelligence. For over 400 years, power has rewritten this plant to suit the needs of statecraft. Empires have cleared ancient purple crops from the surface of the earth, altered maritime trade manifests across 3 oceans, and deployed calculated press lies to turn a humble taproot into a military asset. We live in an age that prides itself on knowing where our food comes from. We read labels, we track regional origins, and we buy into the comforting myth that what we put on our tables is simple, natural, and wholesome. But when you strip away the plastic packaging and look closely at the soil chemistry of our history, the truth is far darker. Our food supply is an archive of past conflicts, a living ledger of trade wars, forced crop selections, and tactical lies. The modern market does not sell you ancient wild nature. It sells you the surviving remnants of imperial logistics, washed clean and illuminated under cold artificial light, so you never ask how it got there. The next time you open your refrigerator and reach for that perfect orange cylinder, remember that you're not holding a produce item. You are holding the surviving banner of a 17th century war protected by a British intelligence deception. I am Julian Vance. Next time, we unpack the manifest of a 19th century cargo ship that carried more gunpowder in its sugar barrels than in its armory.